The man changed his life. He had an ugly face, but he managed to defeat this disease and turn into a handsome young man. But it only got worse, because this transformation did not help him at all, but only destroyed his life. Edward, who has neurofibromatosis, lives in New York and dreams of becoming an actor. So far, his only role has been a minor part in an educational video designed to discourage cruelty and bullying toward people with unique physical appearances. However, the director criticizes his performance, and Edward heads home feeling disheartened. On the subway ride back, he feels the stares of passengers fixated on his face. When a man starts behaving rudely toward others, another stranger hands Edward a business card, saying he's searching for people with unconventional looks for a film. Oddly, the stranger doesn't seem to notice Edward's distinct features. Arriving home, Edward notices a beautiful young woman moving into the apartment next door. Entering his own place, he finds a leak in the ceiling. After setting a bowl under the dripping water, he begins his household chores. A knock at the door startles him, causing him to cut his finger. His new neighbor, Ingrid, seeing the blood, quickly fetches a first aid kit and tends to his wound. Ingrid is assertive, a stark contrast to Edward's quiet, awkward demeanor as he responds to her questions in grunts. She notices a photo of a young woman and a boy, and Edward admits it's his mother. Ingrid realizes his disfigurement wasn't present from birth. Spotting a typewriter, she assumes he's a writer, but he explains he found it on the street. Curious, Ingrid reads a few lines he'd typed and finds them profound and sad. She then reveals she's an aspiring playwright, and upon learning Edward is an actor, suggests they could make it big together. Incidentally, she had initially come by to borrow laundry detergent. The next day, Edward visits his doctor, who warns him that the growths could soon affect his vision. The doctor offers him a spot in trials for a new experimental drug that might help cure his condition. Though unproven, the treatment could potentially change Edward's life. When he gets home, he sees that his front door has been freshly painted and guesses Ingrid was responsible, noting the trail of paint leading to her apartment. Inside, however, the hole in his ceiling has grown, so he places a bucket under the leak. He then takes the typewriter to Ingrid's place as a housewarming gift, but her boyfriend arrives, and Edward awkwardly excuses himself. The next day, Edward auditions with a monologue from Cyrano de Bergerac, pouring his heart into the performance, but the producers remain unimpressed, leaving him dejected. That evening, he shows Ingrid the anti-bullying ad he appeared in. The short clip emphasizes that people with unique appearances are valuable members of society, deserving of acceptance. Although Ingrid isn't particularly moved, she unexpectedly suggests treating the skin on his nose. However, Edward, unused to anyone but doctors touching his face, becomes so uncomfortable that she drops the idea. Determined to change his life, Edward decides to undergo the experimental treatment. At the clinic, he lies on a special table, ready to face whatever the future may hold. AS machines scan his face to analyze the tumors. A new drug is injected under Edward's skin to track his progress. A mold of his face is taken, and he's given a journal to document any changes he experiences. Noticing his bandaged finger, the doctor redresses the wound before Edward heads home, where he observes happy couples strolling by. Unexpectedly, he notices a new Lincoln statue and gazes at it for a long time. As he walks away, the statue seems to come to life. Watching him that evening, he finds a gift bag outside his door containing laundry detergent, face cream, candies, and a note from Ingrid, thanking him for his kindness. Settling on his couch, he opens the candies but starts coughing. Removing the damp bandage from his hand, he discovers that his finger has completely healed. Just then, a part of his ceiling collapses and a dead rat falls into the bucket below. Later that night, Edward is awakened by loud knocking, and shouting emergency responders have come to retrieve his neighbor, who has tragically passed away. Moved by the event, Edward adopts the deceased man's cat and watches from his window as the young man's body is carried away. The following day, Edward and Ingrid have dinner at a cafe. Ingrid asks him many questions, especially pleading with him to never speak of harming himself. The conversation turns to plays he enjoys. when suddenly someone taps on the window and waves at Edward, surprising Ingrid. Before parting, she declares that he will star in the play she's writing. That night, heavy rain worsens the leak in Edward's ceiling. While inspecting it, a piece of plaster falls and injures his face. Wiping the blood, he accidentally peels off a piece of skin from his forehead and cheek. The next morning, the doctor is astonished by Edward's condition, though Edward himself is disturbed. The doctor explains that the treatment is causing diseased cells to shed and be replaced by healthy ones, giving Edward a mask to monitor his progress. Later, Edward feels unwell, but for the first time, a person from the ad he appeared in recognizes him. He stops by a cafe, where the bartender greets him warmly, and another customer acknowledges him. That night, Edward breaks down in tears, but, in a moment of impulse, pulls at his skin, revealing a handsome face underneath. For the first time, he gazes at his reflection, overwhelmed by the transformation, and even learns to whistle, a feat previously impossible due to his lip deformity. Soon after, he goes to a bar, drinks with strangers, meets a woman, and ends the night in the restroom, marking the start of a new chapter in his life. The next morning, Edward's doctor visits. Concerned about his absence from follow-up appointments, Edward lies, claiming the previous tenant passed away, and adopts a new identity, introducing himself as Guy Moratz and ushering the doctor out unaware that Ingrid overhears their conversation. Edward moves into a more luxurious apartment and begins dating multiple women. Over time, he becomes a wealthy and successful real estate agent, though deep down, he remains the same insecure person. One day, he spots Ingrid on the street. Following her, he discovers she is directing a play on a small Broadway stage titled Edward. As he enters and listens to a few lines, Edward realizes that the play is based on his life. He accidentally catches the eye of the casting team auditioning actors for the role of Edward, but despite his transformation, he fails to impress Ingrid. Determined, Edward returns to the theater wearing his mask. Ingrid, surprised by his new look, watches as Edward, now calling himself Guy, delivers an impressive performance alongside the actress portraying her, securing him the role. Later, he tells Ingrid that his childhood friend was similar to the character he portrayed, but has since passed away. This loss, he explains, overwhelmed him during his first audition. Ingrid, however, remains unmoved by his advances, while Edward, surveying the theater, feels like just another face in the crowd. Meanwhile, Ingrid is thrilled to have found someone who can bring her vision to life. Later, Ingrid invites Edward to her apartment, where he notices his old typewriter and the late neighbor's cat, but chooses not to mention their previous owners. She offers him a drink and invites him to dance, and they spend the night together. Soon, Edward begins rehearsing for the play. His performance is outstanding, as he nearly voices his own inner thoughts on stage. One day, a man named Oswald, who also has neurofibromatosis, visits the theater and takes an interest in the production. Charismatic and confident, Oswald finds Edward's performance remarkable. That night, Ingrid suddenly asks Edward to put on his mask, and when he complies, she bursts into laughter, finding it both terrible and amusing. Sometime later, Edward spends an evening out at a bar with his real estate colleagues when Oswald calls out to Guy, referring to him as a future star and complimenting his talent. Much to the amazement of Edward's companions, Oswald's charm quickly captivates everyone, and once again, he commends Guy's acting. At the next rehearsal, Edward critiques Ingrid's interpretation of the main character, sparking an argument, as Ingrid is relying on experiences she hasn't actually had. Oswald arrives again, effortlessly bonding with the cast, and Edward grows more irritated by Oswald's sociability. Even Ingrid is drawn to Oswald as they discover they share similar interests, including favorite books. When she invites Oswald to stay for the rehearsal, he enthusiastically agrees. Later, the cast heads to a bar, where Edward silently watches Oswald and Ingrid animatedly discuss the themes of her play. Oswald questions the plausibility of the protagonist choosing to end his life, expressing that people like him value life deeply. Though Edward laughs along, he becomes increasingly bitter. Oswald charms the group with jokes and anecdotes, even learning to whistle by the end of the night. That night, Edward finds Ingrid rewriting the play. She realizes Oswald was right. Her version of Edward is too dreary and uninspiring, falling into an overly simplistic narrative. Edward is infuriated. He'd voiced similar concerns before, but she only considered them now that Oswald raised them. A heated argument ensues. At the next rehearsal, Edward loses his temper, and his mask repeatedly slips off. Frustrated, he storms out, encountering a cheerful Oswald in the park, practicing yoga and surrounded by admiring women as he watches the Lincoln statue. The two go to karaoke, where a friendly woman openly flirts with Oswald. When Oswald sings, he captivates the crowd with his unique voice. Edward watches in disbelief as everyone enjoys Oswald's performance, ignoring his appearance entirely. At the following rehearsal, Edward learns that Ingrid has given his role to Oswald, as she's now completely reimagined the play. She even had to add a handsome man role, a condition Oswald insisted on, refusing to perform otherwise. Edward is crushed, especially upon realizing how much Ingrid knows about Oswald's personal life. He argues that audiences won't believe such a transformation by the end of the play, but Ingrid counters that it doesn't matter. The heroine sees the protagonist through the eyes of love. Devastated, Edward also faces rejection when Ingrid declines his invitation to meet that evening. The play premieres to great success, and Oswald receives glowing reviews for his performance. Edward watches as Ingrid grows closer to Oswald and sinks further into despair. Oswald's fame rises quickly, with favorable press even featuring him in profiles. One day, Ingrid informs Edward she has to let him go. Edward's mental state unravels as he starts stalking Oswald, eventually witnessing him with a woman and a child. Confronting Ingrid, he accuses Oswald of hiding secrets from her, but she's fully aware of Oswald's daughter and his good relationship with his late wife. She dismisses Edward. Then overhears that Oswald is moving into his old apartment. Enraged, he smashes his recently repaired ceiling. That night, Edward replays the events of his life. The next morning, he greets potential clients in his Edward mask before heading to the office, frightening his colleagues with erratic behavior until he is fired. That evening, he bursts into the theater, creating chaos as he confronts Oswald. During a confrontation with Oswald on stage, part of the set collapses, leaving Edward with severe injuries to his arms and legs. During his recovery, Edward moves back into his old apartment next to Ingrid, who now lives with Oswald and is working on a film adaptation of Edward with a well-known director. Edward remains indifferent, barely responding to the news. He spends his days watching Oswald lead a vibrant life, playing the saxophone, exercising, and enjoying movie nights with Ingrid. Pregnant and glowing with happiness, Ingrid seems almost unrecognizable to Edward. One day, Edward's physiotherapist makes a disdainful comment about people like Oswald, prompting Edward to snap and stab him, resulting in Edward's imprisonment. Years later, Edward encounters Oswald and Ingrid again. Her play is still successful on Broadway, though Oswald has since retired, and the film adaptation was never made to Ingrid's relief. The couple is happy and now planning a move to Canada, where they'll join an artist community as their children are now grown. At the end, a waiter arrives to take their order, but Edward hesitates, unsure of what to choose. Oswald steps in, ordering for him, and jokingly remarks that his old friend hasn't changed at all. The film closes on this scene. The film delves deeply into themes of self-worth, societal acceptance, and the complex human desire to feel seen and valued. Edward's journey is filled with emotional turmoil, driven by his appearance and relentless hope to be accepted for who he truly is. His encounters with Ingrid, an aspiring playwright, and Oswald, a charismatic man who shares his condition but not his insecurities, lay bare the painful contrasts in how society views and values people. Edward's transformation, achieved through medical intervention, brings him temporary relief from his perceived isolation, but it soon becomes apparent that inner acceptance is far more elusive and cannot be granted by external change alone. Through Ingrid's evolving play and Edward's role within it, the film exposes the often superficial layers of human connection. Ingrid's idealistic vision for Edward's character as a victim-turned-hero reflects society's tendency to oversimplify and stereotype, further emphasizing Edward's struggle as he realizes he remains unseen in his own story. Oswald's entry amplifies Edward's inner conflict, as Oswald effortlessly achieves acceptance and admiration, something Edward has long craved but never truly experienced. The narrative ultimately leads us to consider the complexity of identity beyond appearances and accomplishments. Edward's gradual descent, marked by bitterness and resentment, is a stark portrayal of the emotional consequences when self-worth is overly dependent on societal validation. His attempts to imitate Oswald's success reveal an emptiness at the core of this journey, a message about how the approval of others can fail to provide the fulfillment we seek. The closing scenes, where Edward sees Ingrid and Oswald leading a contented life, bring the story full circle, highlighting the quiet resilience needed to endure when society's standards seem unattainable. Edward's final, solitary moment underscores the profound tragedy of unfulfilled potential, and his brief reunion with his former friends paints a bittersweet portrait of the passage of time and the lingering effects of unmet dreams. The film ultimately serves as a poignant reminder that while society may judge us by appearances or accomplishments, true self-worth and peace can only be attained from within.